My name is Martin Hale, and I'm 59 now. This happened 6 years ago. Back when I was teaching third grade at Riverside Elementary, tucked into a working-class neighborhood where most families lived paycheck to paycheck and still found a way to show up for their kids. By then, I'd been a teacher for 28 years. I'd never married, never had children of my own, but every fall, a new group of students quietly became my whole world. I knew their missing teeth, their nervous habits, the way some of them held their pencils too tight, like the paper might run away. I tried to be the kind of adult they could trust, steady, patient, someone who didn't disappear. Money was always tight for me, too. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment over a laundromat, drove an old sedan that coughed in winter, and sometimes bought classroom supplies with my own cash because the kids deserved bright markers and clean notebooks, even if my bank account didn't agree. That autumn afternoon began like any other. The final bell rang at 3:15, and the hallway filled with the sound of backpacks thumping and kids calling goodbye. I stayed behind at my desk, grading spelling tests, letting the quiet settle back into the room. That's when I heard it. Soft, careful crying. The kind children make when they're trying not to be noticed. It came from the reading corner. I looked up and saw Lily Bennett, one of my students, curled into a beanbag chair like she was trying to fold herself small enough to disappear. Lily was 7, with light brown hair, usually tied into a neat ponytail, and blue eyes that always looked a little older than they should. She was bright and diligent, never rude, never disruptive. But I'd noticed a sadness around her from the first week of school. Some kids carried their feelings like a heavy backpack they couldn't set down. I walked over slowly and knelt beside her. "Lily," I said gently, "what's wrong, sweetheart? Did you miss your ride?" She lifted her head. Tears shone on her cheeks. She shook her head. "My dad's always late," she whispered. "He has important meetings." I nodded like it made sense, because to her it did. "Okay," I said, "then why don't we wait together? No rush." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I pulled a small chair close and sat beside her without pushing, without demanding words, just being there. A few minutes passed. Then she asked quietly, "Do you miss your mum, Mr. Hale?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was rude, but because it was honest. In that way children can be, straight to the softest spot. I thought of my own mother, gone for years. "Yeah," I said, "sometimes I do." Lily's voice dropped even lower. "My mom went to heaven last year. She got sick really fast and then she was gone." She swallowed hard, like she had to push the words through. "Dad says she's watching me, but I just want her here." Something in my chest tightened. I'd seen grief in adults, loud and complicated, but grief in a child was different. Small hands trying to carry something far too heavy. "I'm so sorry, Lily," I said. "That's a big loss. It makes sense that it hurts." She sniffed and hurried on, like she needed to defend him before anyone blamed him. "Dad tries. He really tries, but he's always working, and he's always sad, and Ms. Park takes care of me at home, but she's not my mum. And Dad doesn't smile anymore." I looked at her, this tiny person with grown-up worries, and I chose my words carefully. "You know what I think," I said. "I think your dad loves you a lot. Sometimes grown-ups get so sad they forget how to show it. They think they have to be strong all the time, but that doesn't mean they don't care." Lily stared at the carpet thinking. Then she asked the question that broke my heart in a quieter way. "Do you think he wishes I was different?" Lily's question hung between us like a thin thread, trembling in the air. "Do you think he wishes I was different?" she asked again, her voice small. "More fun, maybe less work." I felt something firm settle inside me, an adult's responsibility, gentle but unshakable. Lily, no, I said, carefully and clearly, the way you speak when you want a child to remember the words later. I promise you, your dad doesn't wish you were different. Being a parent can feel hard sometimes, but that isn't your fault. Not even a little. You're a wonderful kid. Her shoulders loosened by a fraction, as if she'd been bracing for an answer she didn't want. We stayed there a while longer, letting the moment pass into safer waters. We talked about her favorite books and the art project our class was working on. She told me, with a hint of pride, about her goldfish named Comet, who ate like he had a job. Little by little, her tears dried. Once or twice, a small smile flickered across her face, brief but real. Still, I couldn't shake what she'd shared. A 7-year-old shouldn't be worried about whether she's too much for the world. At about 3:45, the classroom door opened in a rush. A man stepped in, slightly out of breath, as if he'd been running without realizing it. He wore a charcoal suit that looked expensive in a quiet, effortless way, and his hair was perfectly kept despite the stress in his eyes. This had to be Lily's father. "Lily," he said quickly, his voice strained with apology. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. The meeting ran late." His gaze dropped to her face, still damp from crying, and something crumpled in him. "Were you crying? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad," Lily said softly, already reaching for her backpack. The man's eyes found mine. Tired eyes, guilty eyes, eyes that looked like they had been awake for years. He stepped forward. "I'm a Jonathan Bennett," he said. "I apologize for being late. It won't happen again." "Martin Hale," I replied, standing to shake his hand. His grip was firm, but his palm was slightly cold, like he'd been holding worry instead of warmth. "It's no trouble. Lily and I just talked while we waited." He glanced between us, clearly wondering what Lily had said. "Thank you for staying with her," he added. "I know it's after hours." "It's part of the job," I said simply, though it wasn't, not officially, but some things didn't fit neatly into a job description. As they prepared to leave, Jonathan hesitated. "Mr. Hale, could I speak with you for a moment, privately?" I nodded. He asked Lily to wait in the hallway, and she did, quietly, obediently, like a child used to being reasonable. When the door closed behind her, Jonathan's posture changed. The polished executive look slipped, leaving something rawer underneath. "How is she doing?" he asked. The words pressed out like they'd been trapped. "Really doing? She says she's fine, but I don't think I'm good at this. My wife, she knew how to talk to her, how to understand what Lily needed. I'm trying to keep everything together, and I feel like I'm failing." I kept my voice gentle. "You're not failing. Lily is bright and kind. She's grieving, yes, and she misses her mother. That's normal. But the thing that worries me is this. Lily thinks you're unhappy with her. She thinks she's a burden." His face went pale with shock. "What? No, she's all I have. She's everything." "Then she needs to hear that," I said, "and she needs to see it. She told me you don't smile anymore. That tells me she's carrying your sadness on her shoulders." Jonathan's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice sounded thick, as if it had to move through grief first. "I don't know how to smile when everything reminds me of what I lost. When I look at Lily, I see my wife, her eyes, her expressions. Every day feels like survival." I understood more than I wanted to. "Survival makes sense," I said quietly, "but Lily needs you to do more than survive. She needs you to live, so she can learn it's safe to live too." He swallowed hard, and then, barely above a whisper, he asked, "Will you help me?" And in that moment, I knew this wasn't about tutoring or homework. It was about a child trying not to drown in grief, and a father who didn't yet know how to reach for her hand. So I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I'll help however I can." After that afternoon, things didn't magically become easy. Grief doesn't work like a light switch. but something shifted, like the smallest crack in a door that had been shut too long. Over the next few weeks, I checked in with Lily more intentionally, not in a way that singled her out or made her feel watched. Just small moments. A quiet, "How are you today?" while the other kids unpacked their folders. A gentle reminder that she could stay after class if she ever needed to finish work, or simply sit somewhere safe for a few extra minutes. Soon, she began staying after school once or twice a week. Sometimes we did homework, but more often, she just talked, slowly at first, then with a little more ease, as she realized I wasn't going to rush her, fix her, or turn her feelings into a lesson. She told me about her mum's laugh, how it sounded like the end of a song. She told me how her mum used to leave tiny notes in her lunchbox, even if the note was just a stick-figure smiley face. And she told me about her dad's world, an enormous world that seemed to swallow him whole. "He builds big things," she said one day, drawing careful rectangles on a sheet of scrap paper. "Like buildings. People wear fancy shoes there." "Does he like it?" I asked. She paused, pencil hovering. "I don't know. I think he likes that it keeps him busy." It was one of those answers that didn't sound like it came from a 7-year-old. It sounded like a child who'd been listening too closely. Jonathan started picking her up personally on the afternoon she stayed late. At first, our conversations were brief, polite, professional, almost stiff. He would ask, "Everything okay?" And I'd say, "Yes, she did great today." We spoke like men, standing on opposite sides of a river, both wanting to cross, but unsure where the stepping stones were. But gradually he began to open. One evening, as Lily packed her backpack, he lingered in the doorway. "She talks about you at home," he said, not looking directly at me. "Says you listen." I didn't know what to do with praise. I never had. "She's an easy kid to listen to," I replied. He let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it all day. "I'm trying," he said, "but the more I try, the more I feel behind." Behind. Like parenting was something he could catch up on if he ran fast enough. "Jonathan," I said, carefully, "have you considered counseling? Not just for Lily, for you too." He stiffened, the way some people do when a word touches pride. "Lily went to a child psychologist a few times," he said. "She didn't like it. She said it felt like the doctor was trying to make her talk about things she wasn't ready to say." "That can happen," I said. "The right counselor matters. The fit matters." He hesitated, then admitted, almost grudgingly, "And I don't have time. The company needs me." I looked at him. "Your company will survive without you for an hour a week," I said gently. "Lily might not." He didn't answer, but his eyes flickered, like the words had landed somewhere he couldn't ignore. In early December, Jonathan surprised me again. He showed up at pickup time with Lily beside him and asked, "Would you join us for dinner tonight?" I blinked. "Dinner? She's been asking," he said. "And honestly, I'd like to thank you properly. Please, just dinner." My first instinct was to refuse. Boundaries matter. Teachers are taught to keep distance, to avoid anything that could look improper. But I glanced down at Lily, at the way hope sat on her face like a fragile ornament, and I thought about the invisible wall I'd sensed between father and daughter. Maybe, just maybe, a shared table could become a bridge. "All right," I said, "just dinner." Lily's whole face brightened. "Really?" she breathed, as if she'd been holding that wish in her pocket for weeks. Jonathan gave a stiff nod, but his eyes softened slightly. "I'll pick you up at 6. That evening, I stood in my apartment, staring at my closet, realizing how few options I had. I chose my least worn sports jacket, the one that still held its shape, and tried not to feel foolish as I smoothed the sleeves. When Jonathan's car arrived, sleek and silent compared to my sputtering sedan, I climbed into the back seat beside Lily. She smelled faintly of strawberry shampoo and crayons, like childhood itself. "Mr. Hale," she whispered, leaning close. "Thank you." I wasn't sure she meant for dinner or for everything. "Always," I whispered back. The restaurant Jonathan chose was the kind of place where the lighting was soft on purpose, and the napkins were folded like they had been trained. Everything looked expensive without shouting. As we walked in, I became intensely aware of my scuffed shoes and my jacket that had seen too many school assemblies. Lily, though, was delighted. She wore a pink dress dotted with tiny flowers and walked between us like she belonged anywhere she decided to belong. At the table, she talked the entire time about school, about her goldfish, about how she thought snow smelled like clean paper. Her words filled the space, warm and bright, the way a child's voice can. Jonathan listened, and he tried. He really did. He made sure Lily had enough water. He cut her chicken into smaller pieces when it was too big. He asked questions. But still, I sensed a careful distance in him, like he was performing fatherhood rather than inhabiting it. His smile appeared now and then, but it looked borrowed, like something he'd found in an old drawer and wasn't sure he could wear. Halfway through the meal, Lily excused herself to the restroom with Miss Park, the nanny I'd heard about. The moment they disappeared, Jonathan's posture changed again, like the air got heavier without Lily's small brightness holding it up. He leaned forward. "I want to offer you a position," he said, quietly. I blinked. "A position?" "Not as her teacher," he clarified quickly. "As a private tutor, after school. You'd work with Lily, homework, mentorship, whatever she needs. I can pay you far more than the district does. You deserve it." There it was, the executive solution. Find the best person for the job, hire them, compensate them. A tidy transaction in exchange for something priceless. I set my fork down slowly. "Mr. Bennett, Jonathan, I appreciate that, truly, but I have 24 other students. I can't abandon them." His face tightened, as if he'd expected resistance, but not that kind. "Then let me donate to your school," he said quickly. "Enough to hire support staff, buy supplies, whatever you need. Would that make it possible?" It was generous. It was also, in its own way, another attempt to buy certainty. "I believe in public education," I said, "in being there for all kids, not just the ones who can afford extra help." Jonathan's jaw flexed. "I'm not trying to insult you. I just want the best for my daughter." "I know," I said softly, "but I don't think the best thing for Lily is a private tutor." His eyes sharpened, defensive. "Then what is it?" I hesitated only a second, because I knew the truth would sting. "An engaged, present father," I said. The silence that followed was thick and immediate, like the room had shifted around us. Jonathan leaned back, eyes hard. "You think I'm not engaged?" "I think you're doing your best with what you know," I said carefully. "But you're so focused on providing financially that you're missing what she actually needs." "You don't understand," he said, voice low. I felt my own patience tighten. Not with him, but with the way grief uses work as a hiding place. "I understand loss," I said, sharper than I intended. "And I understand it's easier to stay busy than to feel. But Jonathan, you're not just losing your wife's memory by living like this. You're losing time with your daughter, time you won't get back." He stared at me like I'd slapped him. But there was pain under the anger, pain and fear, and something dangerously close to relief, as if someone had finally said what he'd been trying not to admit. When Lily returned, the air changed again. We smiled. We nodded. We talked about dessert. But the warmth had a seam running through it now. Over the next few days, Jonathan didn't appear. Lily came to school as usual, but she was quieter, her eyes more distant. I wondered if my bluntness had made things worse, if I'd pushed a grieving man too hard and paid for it with a child's hope. Then, on Friday afternoon, Jonathan showed up at my classroom door during my lunch break. He looked different, less polished, more human. His tie was loosened. Dark circles lived under his eyes like he hadn't slept. "Can we talk?" he asked. And the way he said it, small, honest, made me move aside without a word. Jonathan stepped into the classroom like a man entering a room he didn't fully deserve. The cafeteria noise was faint down the hall, but here it was quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of pencil shavings and whiteboard cleaner. He sat in one of the child-sized chairs, knees too high, shoulders slightly hunched. For a moment, he didn't speak. His hands were clasped between his knees, fingers laced so tightly his knuckles looked pale. "I've been thinking about what you said," he finally began, voice rough. "About being present, about grieving with Lily instead of separately." I didn't interrupt. I'd learned long ago that when adults finally speak from the honest place, they need room. "You were right," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him something. "I've been terrified of falling apart in front of her. I thought if I stayed controlled, if I stayed busy, I'd keep her safe." His throat worked, but I wasn't protecting her. I was protecting myself. "It's not too late," I said quietly. He lifted his eyes to mine, and I saw exhaustion there. Real exhaustion, not the kind coffee can fix. "I took your advice, he said. "I found a therapist. I had my first session yesterday. Something in me softened." "That's a big step." "It felt harder than running a company," he admitted with a humorless breath. "Harder than any negotiation I've ever done." He stared at the floor for a moment, as if the next thing was too painful to say out loud. When he spoke again, his voice broke. "Lily told the counselor she thought I was sad because of her," he said. "She thought if she was better behaved, funnier, easier, I would smile again." He pressed his lips together, and his eyes shone. "Do you know what that does to you? To realize your 7-year-old has been carrying your grief like it's her responsibility?" I felt that familiar ache, the one that comes when you're reminded how children will blame themselves before they blame the world. "You didn't know," I said gently, "and now you do. That matters. You're changing course." Jonathan nodded once, a sharp motion like he was trying not to cry. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Not with money, not with offers, just thank you." "That's not necessary," I said, instinctively uncomfortable. "Yes, it is," he insisted, leaning forward. "Your job is to teach reading and math. What you did went beyond that. You saw a child who was hurting, and you stayed. You spoke truth to her father, when I'm sure it would have been easier to stay polite. Sometimes you don't realize the weight of what you've carried until someone names it." I swallowed. "I did what any decent adult should do." He shook his head. "Not everyone does." For a moment, the room held that quiet, the kind that isn't empty but full of something unspoken and heavy and tender. Then Jonathan rubbed a hand over his face, like he could physically wipe the grief away. "We started family counseling too," he said. "Lily and it's messy." He attempted a small smile. "She cried, I cried. I didn't know I still could." "That's good," I said. "Not the pain, but the honesty. Grief wants to isolate people. What you're doing is the opposite." He nodded again, and this time his shoulders looked a fraction less rigid. "I've been leaving work earlier," he said. "We've been eating dinner together at the table." He paused, almost shy. "And she's been talking more about her mom, about school, about silly things." "Silly things matter," I said. "They're proof that joy still fits in the same life as sadness." He held my gaze then, steady. "I don't want Lily to feel alone in this anymore," he said. "I don't want her to think love disappears when someone dies." My chest tightened at that, because it was the truest fear. Not death itself, but what it teaches the living if they aren't careful. "You're doing the hard part," I told him. "You're showing her you're still here." When Jonathan left, he shook my hand firmly, but there was warmth in it now, gratitude without desperation. That afternoon, Lily raised her hand in class to answer a question, and when she got it right, she glanced at me with a shy pride that made my throat tighten. I didn't know what the coming months would bring, but for the first time, I believed something could heal. The changes didn't arrive all at once. They came like early morning light, slow, almost imperceptible, until one day you realized the room wasn't dark anymore. By January, Lily's face had more color in it. Her laughter returned in small bursts, like it had been hiding behind her ribs and was testing whether it was safe to come out. She still had quiet days when she stared out the window too long, or flinched at a Mother's Day craft announcement like it was a bruise being touched, but the heaviness wasn't constant anymore. Jonathan started appearing at school events. At first, it was simple things, a parent-teacher meeting where he actually sat down, phone turned face down on the table. A classroom reading day where he showed up in a sweater instead of a suit, holding a children's book awkwardly as if the pages might bite him. The first time he read aloud, his voice caught on certain words: family, home, forever. He paused once, eyes flicking toward Lily as though to check whether he was hurting her. But Lily looked up at him like she was seeing something new. Not a busy man with a schedule, but a father willing to stumble. Afterward, she ran to him and hugged him around the waist without hesitation. Jonathan froze for a split second. Then slowly, carefully, as if he was relearning the shape of affection, he wrapped his arms around her. I looked away, giving them privacy, though the moment stayed with me the rest of the day. Not long after, Jonathan asked if I'd meet him for coffee. Not dinner, not an offer, just coffee at a small place near the school that smelled like cinnamon and burnt espresso. He arrived 5 minutes early. That alone told me something. I made a donation, he said, once we sat down, as if he needed to get it out quickly before I stopped him. To the school, for library books, computers, art supplies, whatever the principal says you need most. I held up a hand. Jonathan, it's not payment, he said immediately, eyes earnest. It's responsibility. I didn't understand before how much teachers do without being asked, how much you give. I studied him for a moment. If you did it because you believe it helps all the kids, I said, then I won't argue. His shoulders eased in relief. Then he did something that surprised me more than the check. He talked about his wife, not in the guarded way he'd spoken before, like her memory was a fragile artifact he couldn't touch, but in the way people talk when they finally allow love to be alive again. She used to sing while cooking, he said quietly, stirring his coffee, even though it didn't need it. Not well, he added, and the corner of his mouth lifted. But she did it anyway. Lily would dance in the kitchen like it was a stage. He swallowed. His eyes went glossy, but he didn't shut down. I thought if I let myself remember, it would destroy me, he confessed. But counseling, it's teaching me that the remembering isn't the enemy. The running is. I nodded. When you stop running, you can finally hold what you lost without it crushing you. He looked at me then with something like wonder, as if he couldn't believe a simple truth could feel like a lifeline. You talk like you've been here, he said. I have, I replied, just in different clothes. That spring, Lily invited me, very formally, with a handmade card, to her 8th birthday party. It's at my house, she said, careful and proud. Dad says I can invite people who helped me. I showed up on a Saturday afternoon to a home that was frankly stunning. The kind of house you only see from the road and assume belongs to someone else's life. But what struck me wasn't the size of it. It was the photographs. Pictures of Lily's mother were everywhere, not hidden away, not packed into drawers like they were too painful to look at. She was smiling in those photos, arms around Lily, leaning into Jonathan. Their life, before and after, displayed like a truth they weren't afraid of anymore. At the party, Lily laughed loudly, unself-conscious. Jonathan moved through the room greeting parents, but he kept returning to Lily, checking in with his eyes, with his hand on her shoulder, with small touches that said, "I'm here. I'm still here." When it was time for cake, everyone gathered around. "Make a wish," the kids shouted. Lily closed her eyes tight. Her face went solemn for a beat, then she blew out the candles. Later, while the party thinned out and the afternoon sun stretched long across the yard, Lily found me near the table of half-eaten cupcakes. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, "can I tell you my wish?" I crouched to her level. "You know you're not supposed to," I teased gently. "I know," she whispered, leaning closer anyway, "but I want to." She glanced toward her father, who was laughing at something Miss Park said, looking lighter than I'd ever seen him. "I wish that Dad would keep smiling like he did today," Lily said, "that we could both be happy even though Mom isn't here." Her eyes searched mine. "Do you think wishes like that can come true?" I looked at Jonathan, then back to Lily. "I think," I told her softly, "that wish is already starting to come true." That summer arrived quietly, the way summers often do in a teacher's life. One moment you're tying shoelaces and reminding kids about inside voices, and the next you're standing in an empty classroom, the desk stacked, the air too still. On the first week of break, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't an email. It wasn't a quick text. It was a real envelope with careful handwriting, like Jonathan had chosen the slower way on purpose. I stood in my kitchen, the window open to warm air, and opened it with my thumb. Inside was a single page. He wrote about therapy, how the early sessions had felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella, how he'd come home afterward exhausted in a way business meetings had never made him. He wrote about family counseling with Lily, how she'd cried, and how he'd finally let himself cry too. Not as a performance, not to prove anything, but because grief had been pressing on his chest for so long, it had started to feel like his only identity. "We're building a new normal," he wrote, "one that honors her memory without living inside the loss." And then he wrote something I didn't expect, something that landed in me like a small stone dropped into still water. "You changed our lives," he said, "not because you had to, because you cared enough to see past the suit." He described himself as he'd been then, polished on the outside, broken underneath. And he described Lily the way I'd seen her too, a well-behaved child carrying a private grief that no one praised her for, because people only notice when grief becomes loud. At the end of the letter, he mentioned something else. He had established a scholarship fund in his wife's name for students pursuing teaching degrees. "We need more teachers who see children as whole people," he wrote. "This is my way of trying to create more of that in the world." I read that line twice, not because it was grand, but because it was thoughtful, because it was the opposite of a flashy donation meant to impress. It was a decision rooted in something quieter. Gratitude, yes, but also understanding. That day, I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer where I kept a few meaningful things. Old class photos, a thank you card from a student who'd learned to read late, a newspaper clipping from my first year teaching, the small evidence that my life, though modest, had mattered to someone. When school started again in September, Lily moved on to 4th grade with a different teacher. She was excited, nervous, proud, all the right emotions for a child climbing into a new year. But she still stopped by my classroom sometimes. Usually it was small. A quick wave from the doorway, a "Hi, Mr. Hale," tossed like a friendly pebble. Sometimes she came in to show me an art project, bright colors, careful lines, little details that said she was paying attention to the world again. The sadness that had once sat on her face like a permanent shadow wasn't gone completely. Grief doesn't vanish, but it no longer seemed to be steering her life. Jonathan kept his distance in the way of busy parents, but he was present at school events more often than not. And when he did appear, he looked different than the man who'd once rushed into my classroom in a suit and panic. He looked grounded. One afternoon, I saw him waiting near the gates after dismissal. Lily ran to him, and he lowered himself slightly, just enough to meet her halfway, and kissed the top of her head like it was the most natural thing in the world. The moment was small, almost ordinary, and that was exactly what made it extraordinary. Years passed the way they always do, quietly, in layers. New students came into my classroom with their own stories. Some carried joy like a kite string. Some carried pain they didn't yet have words for. I kept teaching, kept grading, kept showing up. I still lived in my modest apartment. I did eventually trade my old sedan for a slightly newer used car, one that didn't sound like it was negotiating with death every time winter arrived. Jonathan remained in my life, not daily, not even weekly, but in the steady way some connections do. A coffee now and then, a holiday card, a quick conversation at a school fundraiser. Despite our different worlds, his boardrooms, my classroom, there was something we shared that made the gap feel smaller. We both knew what it meant to lose people, and we both knew how easy it was to hide inside survival. Jonathan tried a few times to give me gifts I couldn't accept, a watch that probably cost more than my rent, tickets to events I'd never attend. Each time, I thanked him and refused. Finally, one day over coffee, I said, "If you want to give, give where it helps kids who don't have your resources." He nodded, like he'd been waiting for permission to do the right thing in a way that didn't feel like charity. So he did. He supported the school quietly, funding reading programs, adding library books, helping the art teacher order supplies we'd been rationing for years. He didn't ask for plaques or announcements. He just made it easier for children to learn. And Lily grew. It's strange watching a child you once worried about become a teenager with long legs and a voice that changes and a confidence that comes in waves. She still had her mother's eyes. Jonathan had been right about that, but the eyes looked lighter now, less burdened. Then came the invitation, a formal envelope, the kind with embossed lettering, Lily's high school graduation. I went, of course. On the day of the ceremony, the sun was bright and warm, the kind of June afternoon that makes everything look hopeful, even if you're carrying old grief inside you. The lawn outside the school was crowded with families, camera flashes, bouquets, laughter. I spotted Jonathan standing near the front, dressed simply. No showy suit, no tight expression, just a father with pride in his face. When he saw me, he walked over and shook my hand with both of his. "I'm glad you came," he said, voice thick. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. The ceremony began. Names were called. Caps shifted. Teenagers pretended not to cry, while parents fully did. Then, Lily's name was announced. She walked across the stage with her shoulders back, accepting her diploma with calm confidence. When she returned to her seat, I saw Jonathan wipe his eyes quickly, like he didn't want to make it about him. Later, during the speeches, Lily stepped to the microphone. She talked about resilience, about how life doesn't always go the way you plan, about how grief can make you feel like you're standing outside the world looking in. And then she spoke about connection. "There were people who helped me when I didn't know how to ask," she said, her voice steady. "People who reminded me that healing isn't something you do alone." Her gaze moved across the crowd, and for one brief second, it found me. "My third-grade teacher," she continued, "taught me the most important lesson I ever learned. Not math, not reading. A small smile. He taught me that caring for someone can change a life. Sometimes it can change more than one." I felt my throat tighten. The applause around me sounded far away. After the ceremony, we stood on the lawn in the sunlight. the air filled with that mix of endings and beginnings. Jonathan came over, smiling, truly smiling. "You know," he said quietly, "when we first met, I thought success meant building the biggest buildings, making the most money, having the best title." He looked toward Lily, who was taking photos with friends, laughing freely. "You taught me success is simpler than that. It's this: a daughter who smiles, a relationship rebuilt, being present for what matters." I shook my head gently. "You did the hard work," I said. "I just pointed." He exhaled, a sound that carried years in it. "Sometimes that's all someone needs," he said. "Someone to care enough to point out they're heading the wrong way." I looked at Lily again, at the life she'd grown into, at the way her joy now looked like something she trusted. And I thought back to that autumn afternoon when I'd heard quiet crying in the reading corner. One small sound, one small moment, the kind of moment that reminds you why you chose this life in the first place. On my drive home from Lily's graduation, the sunlight faded slowly into evening. The sky turned the color of old paper, and the streetlights blinked on, one by one, like the world was gently reminding itself to keep going. I lived in the same neighborhood I always had. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. Just quiet streets, small porches, grocery stores that smelled like ripe fruit and floor cleaner. When I parked and climbed the stairs to my apartment, I felt a familiar tiredness settle into my bones. Not the heavy kind that comes from hopelessness, but the honest kind, like you'd carried something meaningful. I made tea and sat by the window, and I thought about how strange life can be, how a person can become part of your story without ever intending to, how a child's grief, soft, hidden, almost polite, can change the direction of grown-up lives. I didn't become wealthy. I never owned a house. My furniture was mismatched, and my car still rattled on cold mornings, even if it wasn't as ancient as it used to be. But I had been rich in other ways. Rich in the small notes students left on my desk. Rich in the times a shy child finally spoke up in class. Rich in the quiet trust that forms when a kid realizes you're not going to leave. Over the years, Jonathan tried more than once to give me expensive gifts. Sometimes it was a box left on my doorstep. Sometimes it was a discreet envelope at the end of a school fundraiser. Each time, I returned it. Not because I didn't appreciate his generosity, because I did, but because I needed him to understand something deeper than gratitude. One afternoon, long after Lily had moved on from my classroom, Jonathan and I met for coffee again. We sat near the window, watching rain streak down the glass like thin, steady handwriting. He slid a small, wrapped package across the table. "Just take it," he said softly, almost pleading. "Please, you've earned it." I didn't touch it. I looked at him instead, really looked. The man he'd been when we first met was still inside him somewhere. The man who believed money could solve what pain had broken. But he'd changed too. He was learning. He was trying. "I can't," I said gently, "not because I don't care, but because I want you to keep putting your care in the right place." His eyes dropped. I leaned forward slightly. "You want to honor what happened?" I asked. "Then invest in the kids who don't have your resources. Support the teachers who keep showing up. Help the families who are barely staying afloat." He swallowed. "I've been doing some of that," he admitted, quietly. "I know," I said. "And I'm grateful. Keep doing it." He hesitated, then asked something small, almost childlike. "Do you ever regret it?" he said. "Not taking the gifts, not letting yourself benefit." I thought for a moment. Then I shook my head. "No," I said, "because what I got from you and Lily wasn't something you could wrap in paper. I got to see healing happen. I got to see love survive grief. That's enough." Outside, the rain kept falling. The world kept moving. Jonathan stared at the package, then slowly pulled it back toward himself. "Okay," he said, voice quiet. "Okay." And in that single word, I heard acceptance, not resignation, but understanding. The kind that comes after you finally stop trying to buy your way out of pain and start learning how to live through it. In the years that followed, Lily stayed in touch the way grown kids sometimes do, lightly, naturally, without obligation. A message when she got into a program she wanted. A holiday card, with her handwriting now taller and more confident than it used to be. A quick stop by the school when she came back to visit a younger cousin and asked shyly if she could peek into my classroom. Sometimes she would send photos, her standing in front of a campus building, her and Jonathan on a hiking trail, the two of them smiling in a way that didn't feel forced. In one photo, they stood beside a framed picture of her mother at home, flowers beneath it. Not as a shrine, not as an open wound, just as part of their life. Jonathan, too, continued to grow into fatherhood in a way that felt deeply human. He still worked hard. That was part of who he was, but he made room for what mattered. He didn't treat time with Lily as something he could make up later. He treated it like the fragile, priceless thing it is. Once, years after that first day, I found Lily crying. Jonathan said something to me that stayed. "I used to think grief was a private room," he said quietly. "Somewhere you lock yourself so no one has to see you fall apart." He looked down into his coffee. "But grief isn't meant to be lived alone. That's what you tried to tell me. I just wasn't ready to hear it." I thought about my own losses then. My parents, old friends, the quiet emptiness of some evenings when the world feels too large for one person. It's hard to be ready, I admitted. But the heart, it keeps trying. The scholarship fund Jonathan created continued to grow. I heard about it sometimes through the district. Students who wanted to teach, students who came from modest backgrounds and needed a hand. It wasn't flashy, but it was steady, quietly life-changing. Exactly the kind of help that lasts. And every once in a while, a new teacher would arrive at Riverside Elementary and mention, almost casually, "I'm here because of the Matthews, because of that scholarship." Jonathan never asked me to take credit. He never insisted on being thanked. It was simply a way of turning his pain into something useful, something gentle. As for me, I stayed a teacher. I stayed in my classroom with its uneven desks and its old bookcases, its posters that curled at the corners, no matter how many times I taped them back. I kept buying extra pencils when kids came without them. I kept listening when someone lingered after the bell, pretending they'd forgotten something when really they just needed a quiet adult to notice them. Because that's the truth people don't always see from the outside. Teaching isn't only lessons and tests. It's noticing. It's staying. It's saying, in 100 small ways, you matter. When I think back to that autumn day, the reading corner, the soft crying, Lily's small shoulders curled in on herself, I don't remember it as a tragedy. I remember it as a beginning. A moment when a child's grief met an adult's willingness to sit down beside her and not look away. A moment that reminded a father that love can be shown, not just felt. A moment that proved healing doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with presence. And if I've learned anything in my years, it's this. Sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone isn't to fix their life. It's to stay close enough that they don't have to face it alone.